Hello. Our story begins in the office of the newly crowned Emperor of the Galaxy. Sidious was picking up the pieces of Lord Vader and preparing for what would beset the future of his empire. There were thousands of plans in action from the moment the Empire rose from the ashes of the Republic, and Palpatine implemented everything he could at once. Of course, many of these plans had a place in the future of the galaxy, and had been in place since before the Clone Wars began. But now that the war was over and the collective galaxy had to rely on him as their former leadership, he had the ability to do literally anything he wanted. So he did. Facilities across the galaxy were pushed into full-time operation. Sidious walked alongside the newly crowned Vizier of the Empire as they moved to the door to welcome in more individuals to the office. The Imperial Executive Building was bustling with energy. Instead of just politicians, Imperial officers with the new outfits were filling the halls. It had been about a month since the fall of the Republic and the rise of a more superior system. The Sith Lord needed all the time in the galaxy for the building of his magnificent plans. He told Masameda that he would be, from now on, overseeing every single Senate session. As Vizier, his role was arguably the most important political role in the galaxy. While Palpatine was the Emperor, he was the de facto leader, not a politician. What Palpatine said, went. However, Mas would have the important role of overseeing everything that went down inside the Senate building, making notes of it and reporting on it, and of course, reacting to it. Masameda had a full plate, and Palpatine didn't want him to miss a thing. The Jargon man bowed and marched out of the room with a sense of pride in his step. His loyalty had served him well. Palpatine looked over and watched his silhouette get smaller in the distance as a collection of Imperial officers walked into his office. The Emperor brought them in and requested that they begin sharing their information. Tarkin was the first to speak, and he had a lot to talk about. This meeting would establish the building blocks for what would become the Imperial military, their industrial complex, and potentially the relationship with non-loyal worlds. During this meeting, Palpatine was given a number of alternative options for the standing army that the Empire would use. The reality is, within 10 years, most of the clones would be in their 40s and up. They wouldn't be formidable soldiers at that point, and while there would be individuals that could stand the test of time, the military presence held by the Empire at the moment wouldn't exist then. Palpatine did agree, and he saw a point to it. But the Sith just destroyed 99% of the Jedi because of them. He couldn't not be appreciative of them. Not in a weak way, but in a Sith way. Sidious was grateful for his plan being so successful, and the clones were the perfect soldiers for the task. Letting go of them was always going to be inevitable, but the Sith Lord needed a military that could be strong. Tarkin was very interested in the idea of bringing in human soldiers, but after their inability to be successful, as reported by one of the members of the now disbanded Clone Unit 99, Sidious had little belief in their abilities. He would support the notion of getting rid of the clones and wiping them out if there was a suitable replacement that could make the ultimate sacrifice, a force that could put down anything from Jedi to a smuggler. They were maintaining an empire, and while conflict would naturally breed stronger soldiers, Palpatine wasn't exactly ready to put the defense of the Empire into the hands of civilians. He suggested to Tarkin that they implement initiatives. He wanted to rile up populations in the Mid-Rim and even Outer Rim worlds, send out a division of clones and a division of stormtroopers, see which one is the most effective at shutting down the resistance to the Empire. Sidious wanted no loose ends. Whichever type of trooper was most effective would be the standing army of the Empire. At the same time, because Palpatine was tired of the Kaminaons, he needed someone else to fill their shoes. The Jango Fett Geno had been stretched beyond belief. There was so little that could be done with it anymore. If the Empire planned on cloning more of the Jango Fett clones, then they needed to find Alpha or Omega, both of which having been lost by the Kaminaons. Interesting. Due to Tipoca City being sunk to the bottom of the Kaminoan Sea, Palpatine needed to be ready, just in case any of the opposing senators got testy and figured out what happened at Kamino. Initially, Palpatine would have suggested that the clones weren't right for the Empire, but he couldn't do that now. He expected Tarkin to have a better alternative than regular citizens. Truthfully, Palpatine didn't believe the Imperial Stormtrooper program would prove to be effective. During the war, the Jedi hired bounty hunters to train the clones, especially the clone commandos. Now the Empire was employing Republic commandos to train citizens. That didn't seem fitting. Sidious could imagine a scenario where the clone commandos became fed up with the Empire and turned their backs on them. Luckily, there is always a plan with Sidious. It would take time, but in the following months, Senator Chuchi would reveal the nature of the destruction revolving around Tipoca City. She was trying to make a case for the clones, but instead of getting that done, Palpatine twisted her words. She was trying to get the clones to have some sort of benefit, but when it was revealed that their actions destroyed their own home, Sidious informed the Empire of his plan. Instead of heralding in this new era of troop variant because the stormtroopers failed in the Outer Rim, the Empire would finish off the extermination of the Kaminaons and use their inhibitor chips that were placed inside their brains to make the clone army more loyal to the Empire. They'd have no choice but to fight for the Empire and protect their citizens. If individuals could join the Imperial military like Admiral Rampart and turn the clones against their own home world, then the Empire needed to act now. Being that so many in the Senate were fond of Palpatine, they saw this as a win-win. The usage of his words took everything Chuchi said and flipped it around, forcing the Senate to see the use in clones, though there were questions that followed. How would he maintain control over the clones? Would they produce new clones? Without the Kaminaons, how would Palpatine make sure the clones were just as elite? He had all the answers, and he gave them out without missing a beat. His ease of answer reassured the entire Senate that he had this entire debacle under his control. Of course, he wouldn't just kill off all the Kaminaons. He needed the good ones, but for the most part, they would be eradicated. Palpatine already had a number of cloners lined up, so he could have his pick of the litter. But truthfully, he wanted to expand upon the Jango Fett Geno and make as many clones as he could. First, he needed to find Alpha and Omega. They would be integral for making sure this process worked. Palpatine's belief in the clones may have been rightly placed, but Tarkin believed this to be a mistake. He liked the clones, but they were meant to exist for a time. That time was over. There weren't enough of them to maintain the Empire. But see, that's what Tarkin was missing. The clones were the most elite units in the galaxy. No one would be able to stand up against them. Tarkin could have his Imperial army, but they wouldn't be anything but grunts. Thrown to the wolves be eaten alive in the arena of battle. Sidious needed an assurance though. He couldn't just have the clones existing with free will. As he was quickly learning, the clones were coming to terms with their actions. What happened after the inhibitor chips were turned on could only be explained as a blur. The clones were forced to suffer because of something out of their control. One moment they were with their brothers and sisters in the Jedi, the warriors they trusted. And while not all of them were Obi-Wan or Anakin, there were still warriors on the front lines with them. Moments after the activation, the Jedi were all subsequently killed. For those on Coruscant or across the galaxy, they had to see younglings and Padawans watch helplessly as their masters were gunned down, and then they, too, were hunted. There were only so many Jedi to live through the actions of Order 66. Once the inhibitor chips wore off, it became apparent that despite the clones' own grievances with the Jedi, many of them never really would have wanted this to happen. But their greatest nightmares became true, and they committed atrocities. The issue building for the Sith Lord was how loyal could an army be after they spent 3 years freeing the galaxy, only to submerge it under a similar tyranny to the one they just destroyed. The clones weren't stupid beings, and Sidious knew that, so with his plans in position, he acted on them. The first thing being the reactivation of the inhibitor chips. He pulled each commander in the Grand Army of the Republic, from Commander Fox to Commander Cody, and gave them one simple order, Executive Order 149. It was simple. Undying loyalty to the one who issued the command. If any of their brothers stepped out of the line, it would ensure their automatic death. Instead of having trials, Order 149 required that any trooper ready to resist the rule of the Empire be executed. Clones then would have to live with the fact that they killed their own brothers. But there was a certain irony to it. Order 149 was an executive order that only worked on clone commanders and high-ranking officers. So with these clones laying down their loyalty even harsher for the Empire, it created a disconnect or a connect for some clones. The clones trusted their commanders more than anyone else, and if every single commander in the Grand Army of the Empire chose the Imperial regime over their brothers, then perhaps the Empire should be served with loyalty. It wasn't the easiest decisions for clones not affected by 149, but what else were they supposed to do? Mutiny and die? They couldn't stand up against their commanders because they would just be killed. If they ran away, they'd be found and brought back. It was a horrible cycle, but his entire purpose was buying Sidious time. He took the Jango Fett Geno and brought it to Chief Medical Scientist Nala Se and forced her to expand upon it, which came hand in hand with the capture of Omega. All that remained was the young Boba Fett, who, as it turns out, was Alpha. He would be hired for a job and then never be seen again. Borovio, the one-time Kaminoan colony, would become operational once more, though the big difference is, cloners from all across the galaxy would be operating there. Despite how eager Palpatine was to move forward, there remained one issue, the Kaminaons. As it seemed, despite Nala Se saying that she wouldn't work without Omega, once she had Omega she continued to refuse working. Sidious was given his ultimatum, and without much of a second thought, their entire race was wiped from the face of the galaxy. Palpatine wanted nothing to do with Kamino or their kind. They may have been a talented group of cloners, but their work was over. They set the path forward for more advancements elsewhere. This forced the Empire to bring scientists from around the galaxy into their facilities. There was both a positive and a negative side to this. The scientists either loved the Empire or they hated it, which meant that working conditions for the new cloners became extremely unsuitable. Some of their friends would likely be taken away and killed for not completing tasks or working against the quota. Sidious ran the tightest ship in the galaxy. Once it became clear how this would go, people got to work and did everything within their power to make things the way Palpatine wanted them to be made. There was a reason for this, and Palpatine was adamant about it with a few close people. He wanted to bring himself back to more of a complete form. The cloning project wasn't just for the longevity of the Empire, it was for the longevity of his rule. No one would ever surpass him or rise above him. The Sith would live on forever, and his goal was to exterminate the galaxy, destroy peace, and establish an eternal empire. A real one that couldn't be taken from him in 100 years or 1,000 years, one that would stand the test of time and become generational. Instead of just 1 or 2 cloning facilities, his facilities spanned across the galaxy. Millions of loyal, or forced to be loyal scientists working in tandem. To ensure that no one switched up or rebelled against him, scientists were relocated every 3 months. With new facilities popping up by the month, it was very easy to relocate scientists to ensure their maximum potential and their maximum abilities. All these facilities had the same layout, so it wasn't that hard to adjust. Sidious's empire grew as this was happening. There were rumors of pirate organizations growing in the Outer Rim, but that didn't matter. They didn't need to worry about Crimson Dawn. They weren't a threat. When the Empire ran out of systems to take over, they'd push for the Outer Rim. Because of the focus on cloning, the project that Tarkin promised Palpatine became nothing but a fever dream. The idea of Project Stardust becoming a reality was illogical. The Empire focused its resources on star tech and building a military. If there was room for a Death Star, then perhaps it could be included, but Sidious wanted the clones to be the best they could be. With both Alpha and Omega captured by the Empire and the Kaminaons all but extinct, Sidious used the 2 perfect replica clones to expand the DNA of Jango Fett. It wasn't easy, and it did cost both of their lives, but it was a small price to pay for a future like the one Sidious wanted. The loss of the facilities on Kamino were daunting, but with the amount of credits at their disposal, the Empire could replace it. Borovia became the closest replica to Dapoka City, simply because Borovia was once a Kaminoan colony. But with new scientists running the facilities, they were able to push for new platforms be added, just so that the cloners could build more, have more clones, have more whatever they needed. This did also expand to other gas giants and uninhabited planets across the galaxy, filling up empty spaces with facilities that could create clones. All the early generation clones were getting older by the day, so Palpatine pushed for 2 variants of clones, ones that were released as adults, and ones that would be raised as children into adults without accelerated growth. This meant that the Empire planned on building a long-standing army, one that would take 18 years to develop per batch. But as good as things were looking for Sidious, there was a rebellion growing. It had been 3 years since the rise of the Empire, and while the cloning facilities were working to a maximum capacity, there were issues growing. Enough clones had been executed by their brainwashed commanders that it was time for resistance. Clones across the galaxy saw their moment to rise up. For the past 1.5 years, they'd been doing everything within their power to communicate with each other so they can unite for this rebellion. The hope of 149 is that the commanders would be able to maintain control, and in a republic, they would have. But this was an empire, and in a tyranny, one must force control so that they don't lose it. The state of order is so unnatural that one cannot stand for it. The clones fought for freedom, and it was their time to rise up, though it would not be a full-blown clone rebellion. It would be the rise of a rebel cell. All of it started on Coruscant, and it was a holdout inside the Imperial military facility. The clones captured the facility, killing off any non-clone personnel, and then capturing every single clone that did not side with them. Palpatine was immediately notified, and thus sending his enforcer down to the facility. Vader and a group of his most elite men traveled down to the structure and marched right in. The clones had anti-aircraft, but Vader wasn't stupid enough to come through the air. Instead, they brought prototype Imperial vehicles down the walkway and opened fire on the facility. The manned turbo lasers were destroyed, and as the clones retreated into their base, they were fired upon. Vader ripped the doors off the building as he and his men piled in, killing everyone in sight. The clones who were captured were given a chance to fight for their empire once more, and the death toll was relatively catastrophic. As it was figured out, most of the rebel clones killed in battle were Generation 1 clones. Because this happened at an Imperial facility, Sidious was able to cover it up, and as for the leader of this little insurrection, he'd be treated accordingly. Vader made sure to bring Commander Cody back to his Emperor in shackles. The torture he received would last for the longer part of a year. Cody would be turned into a Frankenstein, unrecognizable by the time he died. Sidious used him for experiments. This did go for many other clones that ended up betraying the Empire. This little clone rebellion would have ripples to the galaxy, and the few planets that actually saw it didn't have a loud enough voice to try and even resist the might of the Empire. They tried to inform Palpatine, but it was swept under the rug as more Imperial clone troopers were dropped into their cities. Even Vader had his own issues with how Palpatine handled this. He, even in his evilness, could not understand the belittling of the clones. They were terrific soldiers, and their fate seemed unfair. This was at a point where Vader didn't know everything going on within the Empire. For example, the fact that slavery existed under Imperial protection was something he was unaware of. Darth Vader had such a little understanding of the greater plan that Sidious had, so his focus on the clone issue would be the only piece of anchor he could hold towards his master. Because of this clone rebellion on Coruscant and elsewhere in the galaxy, Sidious pushed heavier on the incentive to bring able-bodied clones into the armed forces. However, there was an issue already looming with these clones. The cloners figured out how to transmit all the information into the clones through an alternative chip placed in their brain, so they wouldn't have to go through the developmental process and could be just rolled off the assembly line. However, not all of them were capable soldiers. About half of them were either brain dead to the amount of information forced into their brains, or chip implosions, which were deadly. The other half of the units were as close as a clone could get to a robot. They had no personality and they were nothing but walking machines. Almost like Vader. Kind of ironic. The clones who were introduced to these rolled off the line clones knew that something was up, but they couldn't figure it out. The clones that didn't join the rebellion saw all these new clones as outcasts. It was weird for them. The original models knew that they were different. The new models just joined up and went along their way. For all the older clones, this was a slap in the face, but there was a silver lining. Due to all the failures with the instant release batches of clones, significant advances were made by the cloners. These advancements went beyond even what the Kaminaons had discovered thus far. The goal was to reduce the accelerated aging for the loyal clones, almost giving them a sense of life. It was the gift the Empire could give back to them, especially without Rio Chuchi trying to step in the way. In a sick way, the Empire did this with everyone, not just their soldiers. They gave them just a little bit, enough to bite onto, a piece of care, whether it be through financial, substance, medical, or material. The individual, either clones or civilians, would take it and eat it up, praising their emperor for being so kind to them, when in reality they were suffering under the guise of a perfect system. The Empire left behind the shambles of the Republic, and the collective system was stronger and richer than ever before. So that had to be a good thing, right? Only the wealthiest felt the gift of the Empire. But that's alright because the Emperor could give back to them from time to time. The clones felt this, and they were eternally appreciative, many of them getting close to their 30s and not prepared for the end of their lives. Because it had only been 3 years since the fall of the Republic, most of the clones were approaching 15 in their real years of life, and the thought of rapidly approaching the end of their lives was tormenting. With this new potential guarantee from the Empire, they might be able to live fuller lives. Within the following 2 years, it was an accomplished task, and the original clones were given an extension in life. This was through the usage of Alpha and Omega, which were now long dead. But the use of their DNA and their biological models allowed the Empire to make more technological advancements in cloning. Vader still didn't know much of anything aside from the additional inhibitor chips. He didn't know what it was, but essentially in the days leading up to the age reduction action, every single clone was brought in for cleansing. The way it was described is that the Empire was ensuring they wouldn't be killed in the process of de-aging, suggesting that the results of the de-aging cost the lives of a number of clones in the trial period. They figured out that the surgery would help them in this process. Of course, that's not the truth. The inhibitor chips were out of date. They needed a new set of orders, and Palpatine was very involved in this process. There was an order for wiping out Vader, wiping out Imperial military officers that didn't serve the Empire, and so on and so forth. These chips also had some side effects, most of them revolving around making the clones more docile than they already were, and even removing pieces of their memories and their personalities. What made it better is this chip had an algorithm built inside of it, so every single memory and personality trait within a clone would be selected at random and removed. Not all of them at once, but just a few to make them a little easier to control. This too had some side effects, but they were also much rarer. The only side effects is some of the clones would completely lose their mind, but it could only be triggered by accident. It wasn't something that happened on a common occurrence. At this point, Sidious was donating his DNA to the cloners, the most elite of which were being taken out of their primary facilities and brought to Exegol to continue working on Sidious's plan. He would ensure that he could live forever. It was a dream of the Sith, and it would come to fruition. He knew it would. With no one rising up to fight the Empire, Sidious had all the time in the galaxy to make it happen. He went to facilities on Exegol to oversee it himself, and the results were incredible. But they were far from complete. Something Sidious didn't realize was how poisonous the dark side was. Of course he knew it was poisonous, but to the extent that it was, he wasn't aware of. His DNA caused every clone to come out disfigured and ripped into pieces. Really ugly pieces of work, unlike the Jango Fett Geno. Sidious couldn't believe it, but he knew they'd figure it out eventually. Because after all, every single Jedi killed since the Purge, including some incredibly Force-sensitive individuals, were brought to Fortress Inquisitorius to be kept in storage. Each of these bodies were quietly taken off-world and transported elsewhere, specifically Exegol. At the thought of how powerful this cloning could become, Sidious believed it was time for the Inquisitors to hunt down the former Grand Master of the Jedi Order. He had been concealing his essence for too long, but according to data inside the Jedi Temple, his midichlorian count was off the charts. Not comparable to Skywalker, but higher than Palpatine's. He wanted it, so these death squads were sent out to find the former Grand Master. Across the galaxy, the clones continued doing their job, and with their effectiveness being noted with the death of extremist rebels and even potential alliances, Sidious knew he made the right choice. A couple years later, Vader would lose his fight to Obi-Wan on a moon outside of Jabim. By this point, the Dark Lord had been taking DNA strands from Vader, mostly when he was idle inside of his Bacta tank inside Vader's castle. This of course was accomplished by the Royal Guardsmen inside the castle. The strands were sent to Exegol and being used. Sidious couldn't help but admit that he was disappointed in Vader's resolve, but he hadn't worn out his usefulness by this point. He had other plans for his failure of a student. Sidious knew that Vader would be useful until there was another. Palpatine's plans had been going well up until this point. Imperial legions were outfitted with clone troopers, and the Imperial army was growing by the day. Attacks on non-Empire worlds were constant, and the clones barely had a place in any of this conflict. They were simply lurking until they were needed. The clones were the most elite unit in the Empire aside from Special Forces, so no need to waste them. The batches of lifetime clones across the multitude of star systems were approaching their teens at this point, and Sidious visited them to see their progress consistently. At the moment, about 97.3% of the scientists were fully on board with the Empire. There were very few that were trying to work against them, and those that were often suffered the worst punishments. Sidious then called for the creation of experimental units, similar to Clone Force 99. While his empire grew, there were many officers that supported this notion. Tarkin believed that the Empire would thrive off a larger military, bigger weapons, stronger guns, and so forth. Palpatine did agree, and he liked the idea of a planet-killing weapon. However, there was no delivery. This created a divide between the two lifetime allies. No one was permanently safe, no matter who they were and how close they were to Palpatine. And if Tarkin continued to distance himself from the Emperor and his ideals, then his place next to him would likely be up for grabs. The Death Star was nothing but a fever dream, and despite the work provided by Galen Erso, there was still much that needed to be completed, especially with Orson Krennic having very little to show for, despite the project being Tarkin's baby, apparently. It was a revolving circus of pointing fingers, and truthfully, Palpatine couldn't care less. They wanted to play politics with weapons of mass destruction. He wanted to build a long-standing empire. The mindset of many early generational clones was similar. They loved the Empire. This was both in part to their new chips, but also the reduce in their aging. They felt younger than ever before. Their bones weren't stiffening, and they actually had a shot at living a full life. Palpatine wasn't showing them mercy by doing this. He was buying himself loyalty. This kind of loyalty couldn't be forced onto anyone, and while he did enjoy the Imperial military, none of the soldiers were nearly as elite as the clones. Sidious did try and build an alliance or something with the Mandalorians, but their lack of care towards him and his empire earned them a short drop and a sudden stop. The Empire, especially with the clones, didn't care for any population. Despite the effectiveness of the Imperial military, the clones were ruthless fighters. Every time they went to battle, they didn't just win, they decimated populations. The few survivors that remained were rounded up and sent off to a number of spice mines or worse. Vader obviously never saw this side of the conflict. If he led an army into battle, he won his little war and then vanished from the battlefield before the slaves were taken away. Ironically, clone happiness was higher than it was during the Clone Wars. Perhaps it was a leisure of wiping the floor with militias, or perhaps it was a lack of Jedi, but the clones lived their fuller lives, literally and figuratively. The commanders were still affected by a variant of 149, which is now considered Order 50. It just made sure they were the most loyal and easiest to control within the Grand Army of the Empire. At the same time, Sidious would be hailed to Dagobah to join up with an elite unit of clone commandos, having discovered Yoda. He had killed a couple of their brothers, but before they died they communicated their position to their brothers. The clones accompanied Sidious to the ground, and he found the former Grand Master himself. Despite how connected Yoda was to the Force, he didn't use it like he used to. Age had done him in, and Sidious wasn't here to kill him. He was here to capture him. The two avatars of light and dark engaged in a battle of the Force. The old Jedi Master leapt from tree to tree, using the landscape to his advantage. The clone commandos hunted him down, blasting down pieces of the forest, killing animals in the way, and gunning for him every time a stick broke. Sidious crushed Yoda's home, and then when the Jedi Master returned from the forest with his lightsaber, he looked ready to finish what he couldn't before. But that didn't come so easily. Sidious had so much more power at this point, and when Yoda attacked, he was thrown back and electrocuted until he fell unconscious. Something was so rewarding about seeing Yoda in this predicament, weak and feeble. The years in hiding obviously did not serve him. This capture meant that only one more Jedi Master from the High Council remained, and while he may have defeated Vader twice, Sidious at this point didn't care what happened to his apprentice. A new chosen one had surely been born already. They would never eclipse Anakin's full potential, but they would suffice, whoever they might be. As Yoda's burnt body was sent in shackles to Exegol to become an experiment, Sidious enlisted Vader and Tarkin to take down the rebels. With clones by their sides, it wouldn't take much. While Palpatine hated the idea of using citizens or people in the military, there were talented individuals within the Army and the Navy that found themselves in roles outside of regular divisions. Similarly to the Clone Wars, the most elite would proceed over the clones, and as Tarkin and Vader went in to handle rebel cells, Thrawn rose through the ranks. He earned himself a seat with the highest-ranked Imperial officers for his loyalty and also his efficiency. As for the ISB, that was controlled by mostly civilians, operated by clones in the middle somewhere. Before every single one of these rebel cells died out, the first experimental unit of clones was released. These clones weren't lifetime batch clones, they were instant release clones. They're very similar to Clone Force 99, but their attributes were much more amplified and it was spread out across a squad of 23. Though because they were instant release clones, only 17 of them made it out, which was better than the original ratio for instant release clones. At the same time, the destruction of the rebels did come with the death of a couple of senators in the Senate, including the extermination of all the Organas, Mothmas, and Chuchis. Anyone associated with the senator or their families were also targeted and killed, just to be safe. All of them looked like accidents though, thanks to the work done by the clones. The destruction of the fragments of the Alliance was accomplished all by the clone army. It was a beneficial achievement for the Empire. However, what followed it was the tension between Vader and Sidious. The Dark Lord learned about the slaves in the galaxy, and Sidious gaslit his student into believing these slaves were treated better than anyone else in the galaxy, reminding him of the destruction levied against Crimson Dawn years before. Vader understood, but he didn't stop. He continued on an investigation. This investigation took months, but it led him to figuring out everything. The true design of the Empire, the clones, the samples, the slavery, oppression, everything, and despite being evil for so long, he couldn't stand for it. He couldn't stand for an empire built on the backs of slaves. All of his rage and anger couldn't contain him. He learned this information after traveling to Edo, due to rumors circulating around an Imperial scientist who was revealing information to a pilot. The truth is, Project Stardust would never see the light of day. Without the rebels, the TIE Defender project was being handed over to Thrawn and receiving funding from the Empire and Lothal. Clone pilots were already elite, and with the TIE Defender, they would be unstoppable. So the Death Star would never come to be. And because Galen Erso was an Imperial scientist, he didn't just know the logistics of the Death Star. He knew the cloning programs around the galaxy too. So when Vader came to him, he revealed everything he knew, and sent Vader to Scarif, where he would be outraged to learn that his DNA was in their records. Sidious was using them for his own game, and he would not stand for that. The Dark Lord would approach Sidious, and a massive duel would begin. Palpatine didn't expect it to come, but he was able to handle himself, pulling lightsabers from hidden compartments and engaging with his apprentice. Sidious played the game, because Vader would never have a chance. He used all his strength, speed, and power, but it was never enough. Sidious cut Vader down and subsequently shipped his body off to Exegol to continue building a legacy for his own empire. It was also at this same time where the batch of lifetime clones would be released from their facilities across the galaxy, finally 18 years old. Palpatine made a show of his new army at a newly constructed temple on Tython, having ripped down the Jedi Temple present and setting up a palace for a show of force. Sidious looked down at his new army and inspired them, before sending them out to the galaxy that they might find victory and destroy all who opposed them, though they didn't expect those who opposed them to be a group of other clone troopers. Thanks to troopers who had been reported as dead, who snuck into the ranks of the clone army, early clones as Rex, Wolf, and Gregor would remove all their inhibitor chips. Well, not all of them, but the commanders, so that they could help their men. It was a quick process, but it resulted in several generations of clones turning on the Empire at once. Their objective wasn't to harm the people of the Empire, rather, it was to destroy the Emperor. The newly released clones were a force to be reckoned with, but they were also very quickly cut down and killed. Not all of them, but the first skirmish on Tython cost the lives of 10,000 shinies, none of them having seen combat, going up against an army of 12,000 clones who had been fighting for the last 20 years of their lives. The rebel clones fought with everything, only 1,500 of them dying in the first conflict of the skirmish. The second skirmish cost them 2,700, but that was mostly due to the aid from the Special Force unit of Squad 17. Really unoriginal, simply due to the fact that it was the size of their squad. Anyways, Sidious wished that these clones would have been more prepared, but with them driven into a retreat, all that stood between the clones and Sidious was himself. Perhaps his loyalty to the clone program had done him in. The thought of having survived every single other fight and then being killed by creatures that he brought to life made his stomach turn. How pathetic, he thought to himself. The early generational clones were sporting gray hairs and wrinkles, led by 3 clones who never faced the assistance of their accelerated aging. Obviously, Rex, Wolf, and Gregor looked a lot worse than the rest of them. Palpatine walked out of his beautiful new palace and looked at the thousands of clones coming his way. He informed him, his voice booming over the canyons and out towards their position, that nothing would stop him. The clones raised their weapons towards him and he smiled to himself, telling them that they had chosen death. Sidious raised his 2 hands and let the clones come towards him, some of them already opening fire, despite Rex not giving them the order to do so. Sidious wasn't affected. Lightning bursted out of his fingertips and the clone armies melted. Their screams of agony could be heard miles away. The sound of booming electricity only reinforced their lack of permanence. An army raised, having given him 20 years of Imperial presence wiped away in a matter of seconds. Sidious would have to deal with these lifelong batches. However, despite how cruel he could be, he knew that it wasn't their fault. There was no way they could stand up to an army that had been fighting for 20 years, plus the 10 years of training they had before that. The new clones were just simply outmatched, but Sidious would need to change that immediately. These new clones would be sent to the Outer Rim to take territory from all the scum present out there and wage war. This forced people to either join or die. It was simple: join the Empire or become ash. This forced many individuals into the Empire, including one Luke Skywalker, who without an organized rebellion had nowhere else to go aside from an Imperial Academy, a choice he initially rejected before the invasion. Luke's time inside the Empire lasted for a good couple of years. He would be able to provide for his family and do exactly what he wanted to do. Be somewhat free. It wasn't true freedom, and he wasn't stationed with the elite units of the Empire, so he knew he was cannon fodder, but at least Owen and Brewer were taken care of, which made him feel a little better. But there was also a dying resistance in the galaxy. Sidious's empire was unstoppable, mostly in part to the clones. As Sidious continued going, he received news from an Outer Rim base, one informing him of a boy with a midichlorian count higher than his own. Sidious went immediately. He'd been trying essence transfers on Skywalker clones, and all of them died instantaneously. The clones didn't have the force sensitivity to handle his essence. It's why Palpatine's son, Tython, was allowed to escape from the facilities on Exegol. He was the only normal clone. He just didn't have any force sensitivity, like none. Everyone in the galaxy was connected to the force in some way. He wasn't. So Palpatine traveled to Tatooine outpost and met with Luke Skywalker, telling him that he was being brought back to an Imperial headquarters and receiving an upgrade to his rank. Obviously, that was a lie, because Sidious took Luke to Exegol, where he would perform the first successful essence transfer seen in generations, a long-lost ability, reclaimed by the Dark Lord of the Sith. Luke's soul would be ripped apart, replaced by pure evil. Sidious felt so much energy, all of his knowledge, all of his power now amplified thanks to a potential that Luke Skywalker could have had. Shame his aunt and uncle never removed his last name. No matter, they'd be given a pass, removed from Tatooine and put inside the core for taking care of an asset for so long. Sidious did understand that he needed a new apprentice, but the galaxy was already reshaping. Rumors had it that Obi-Wan Kenobi was still elusive in the Outer Rim, despite outposts put everywhere by the Empire. He was working his hardest to find Luke, but never learning of his station. He would die miserably, and that would be just the perfect end to the Jedi High Council. Sidious's Inquisitors were still around, but they weren't important. They led the clones in the conflicts, but there was so much peace here. With Thrawn overseeing most of the Imperial military, due to Tarkin's displacement, Because of his inability to let the clones be the main focus of the Empire, Sidious pushed for Imperial expansion into new galaxies. Thrawn was up to the task of dismantling what remained of the unfinished Project Stardust and using them for new projects. He knew they could do it, they just needed to use their resources and fund the project, which Palpatine was doing. To make sure no one questioned who the Emperor was with his new body, he wore the robes and made sure he covered up his face more. He was able to adjust his voice appropriately as well. But for Palpatine, he never felt more alive. The clones gifted him all the time he needed to make sure the galaxy would bend to his rule. But it wouldn't just be his galaxy, it would be every galaxy outwards from here. In the coming years, Thrawn's projects would bring the Empire to a new galaxy, not far from their current one. Settlements grew, and the clone army began its next leg of conquest on the universe. Palpatine's lifetime batches continued pouring out. After all the lifetime batches were one after the other, each facility releasing nearly 100,000 units per year. With all the time in the galaxy and the Senate disbanded from Masameda's control, Sidious began experimenting with Force-sensitive clones, hoping he could construct a Sith army, one to do his bidding. While the Inquisitors were useful, he longed for a student, though that longing wasn't missing or lacking for him, rather just ensuring he could pass his lessons on to someone like him. He found the answer to it though, and it was just as he hoped. It came from his son, Tython, the clone boy with no connection to the Force. The child married a Force-sensitive woman, not extremely sensitive, not enough to make it into the Jedi Order, but just enough. They had a child, and their daughter was the child Sidious hoped that Tython would bring into the world. Grand Inquisitor would hunt down both Tython and Miramar, killing them both and freeing Rey from what would later be referred to as evil Jedi. Sidious wouldn't need a new body for a long time. However, an apprentice that could match his potential and even potentially excel could be useful, just depending on how it was done. Sidious's intention was to repeat the same steps he did with Plagueis, this time with his granddaughter. Only the end of their dynamic would come when she died of a natural death. Sidious would have it play out by ear, until the appropriate moment was upon them. Though Sidious would never be replaced, he would use his descendants to continue providing insight into the Force. Every new generation, the Force would try and stop him, and every time, he was more prepared than the last. Whether it was a war in another galaxy, a reincarnation of the Jedi, nothing could stop him. Obi-Wan even tried to find him in his late 90s, only to be killed by the Emperor's granddaughter. There was no one who could stand up to him because he could never be touched. The Emperor was eternal, the greatest Sith Lord the galaxy had ever seen, carried by an army originally designed for a 3-year war. The clones provided the firepower and the proper abilities to fight guerrilla fighters and force syndicates to submit. There wasn't a challenge they couldn't defeat, even if it came from other galaxies such as Avong. Sidious continued expanding upon his knowledge, allowing Grand Inquisitor to continue adding to the inquisitorius, but keeping the mastery of the Sith to himself and his students. The rule of two finally becoming a family legacy, as the Sith never found destruction and Sidious never ended his ever-expanding intergalactic rule. And that, my friends, is our dark side story. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Bandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Cullen Rooney, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, Eternal Padawan, Joshua Dem, Jenna Naguin, Saints Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngly Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Ford is Likely Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with 3 First Names, Darksaint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Some more other ways, go check out the Patreon. Really cool things on there. Sith Clone Wars is wrapping up in the coming weeks. So let's talk about the story. The main conflict I had was trying to get Palpatine to be in line with it. It has to be through Palpatine. There's no other way that the clones would be allowed into the Empire without him. I think Palpatine would just make sure that he could just have his Empire. The entire point of this is for him to do what he was doing in Rise of Skywalker, setting up this entire time. We see it in Bad Batch, Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, all that stuff. The setup for what will become the final order, and he does that without having to get to a final order here. It's like he sets everything up and then he just expands. He just takes advantage of everyone. It's the mastermind having actually worked, instead of having to rely on contingency plans to redo what was undone. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.